As one of the prisoners stepped out of line and kept walking instead of stopping, the others didn't look at the guards anymore. They looked at him, because for the first time, someone was about to find out what would actually happen if he didn't stop. No one told him to stop. The prisoners stood in a loose formation across the yard, holding their positions while facing forward, their posture steady as they remained where they had been placed without shifting their alignment. One man near the edge adjusted his stance slightly, stepping a few inches to the side as he repositioned himself within the line. Another prisoner turned his head briefly toward the guards, then returned his gaze forward while maintaining his position. A third man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then steadied himself again without moving further. The man at the edge stepped forward once, placing his foot beyond the line while the others remained still. One prisoner beside him turned his head toward that movement, holding his gaze as the step was completed. Another man near the center adjusted his stance slightly, then stopped as he noticed the change at the edge. The man at the edge took another step forward, increasing the distance between himself and the line without hesitation. One prisoner behind him straightened his posture slightly, focusing his attention on the movement instead of the guards. Another man shifted his position just enough to keep the moving figure in view, then stopped again. The man continued forward with a steady pace, taking a third step that placed him clearly outside the formation. One prisoner near the back leaned slightly forward, watching closely as the distance increased. Another man turned his head fully toward the movement, no longer facing forward. The man walking did not slow, did not turn, and did not look back as he moved further across the yard. One prisoner stepped half a step forward as if preparing to follow, then stopped before completing the movement. Another man tightened his stance, holding himself still while continuing to watch. The walking figure reached a point where the space around him was completely open, no longer aligned with anyone else. The line that had been stable moments before now held stillness in every direction except one. And as the distance continued to grow without interruption, the first moment took place, because what had just started had not been stopped. Are you enjoying this deep dive? Most people don't know this side of the war. If you're one of the few who values true history, subscribe now and help us grow this archive. As the distance between the man and the formation continued to increase, the stillness across the yard began to shift into focused attention, not directed toward the guards as before, but toward the single figure moving away without interruption. One prisoner near the center turned his body slightly, no longer facing forward, aligning himself with the direction of the movement as he watched. Another man beside him adjusted his stance, widening his position just enough to maintain a clear view of the path ahead. A third prisoner near the back leaned forward slightly, shifting his weight as if preparing to move, then stopped and held his position. The man continued walking at the same pace, placing each step steadily without hesitation, increasing the space behind him with every movement. One prisoner closer to the front turned his head fully toward the guards, checking for a reaction, then returned his gaze to the moving figure when none came. Another man shifted his footing again, repositioning himself to follow the movement visually, then remained still. A third prisoner stepped half a step forward out of alignment, then stopped before committing to the motion. The walking figure passed beyond the area where the line had originally formed, entering a wider space where no one stood near him. One prisoner near the edge raised his head slightly, tracking the movement more directly as the distance grew. Another man straightened his posture and fixed his gaze forward, no longer dividing his attention between the guards and the formation. A third prisoner adjusted his position again, stepping a few inches to the side to maintain a clear line of sight. The man walking continued forward without slowing, without turning, and without acknowledging the distance he had already created. One prisoner near the back shifted his stance again, placing his feet more firmly on the ground as he watched. Another man tightened his posture, holding himself completely still while following the movement. A third prisoner leaned slightly forward once more, then returned to an upright position as he remained in place. The guards remained unchanged, holding their positions without movement, without speaking, and without altering the pattern that was unfolding. The entire yard now held a single direction of attention, with every movement replaced by observation of what was happening at a distance. And as the man continued forward without interruption and the absence of response remained unchanged, the second moment took place, because what had begun as a single step had now become a test that no one else was willing to repeat. As the man moved further into the open space and the distance behind him became impossible to ignore, the stillness across the yard began to change in a different way, not through movement, but through tension building in every direction as all eyes remained fixed on what would happen next. One prisoner near the front shifted his stance slightly, turning his body more fully toward the direction of the movement, then held that position without stepping forward. Another man beside him adjusted his footing again, placing his weight forward for a brief moment as if preparing to move, then stopping before completing the action. A third prisoner near the back leaned forward more noticeably this time, extending his posture while watching, then slowly returned to a balanced stance. The man walking reduced his pace slightly for the first time, not stopping, but allowing his steps to become slower as he approached the far edge of the yard. One prisoner closer to the center turned his head toward the guards again, holding his gaze longer as he waited for a reaction, then returned his focus to the moving figure. Another man shifted his position a few inches forward, breaking the original alignment again, then held that new position without continuing. A third prisoner stepped half a step forward and stopped, holding his position just outside the line without moving further. The man walking reached a point where the boundary of the yard became visible ahead of him, the space narrowing as he approached it. One prisoner near the edge raised his head slightly, tracking the movement more closely as the distance became critical. Another man straightened his posture again, fixing his attention forward without looking away. A third prisoner adjusted his stance once more, widening his position to maintain a clear view. The man slowed again as he neared the boundary, placing his foot down more carefully than before, then continuing forward. One prisoner near the back shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then stopped completely, holding still. Another man tightened his posture, standing rigid as he watched the final approach. A third prisoner leaned forward again, then stopped, holding that position as if waiting for something to happen. The guards remained unchanged, still without movement, still without any visible reaction, leaving the space ahead completely unchallenged. The entire yard held its focus on a single point now, where the distance, the boundary, and the absence of response were about to meet. And as the man approached the edge without being stopped and no one moved to intervene, the third moment took place, because the test had reached the point where it could no longer remain uncertain. As the man reached the edge of the yard and the boundary stood directly in front of him, the entire space behind him held still, not because anything had forced it to stop, but because the next action would define everything that came after it. One prisoner near the front leaned slightly forward, extending his posture as he watched the final steps unfold, then held himself still. Another man beside him shifted his stance again, placing his weight forward as if preparing to move, then stopping before taking a step. A third prisoner near the center adjusted his footing, widening his position while keeping his eyes fixed ahead. The man at the edge slowed his movement further, placing his foot down carefully as he approached the boundary, then taking another step that brought him directly in front of it. One prisoner near the back raised his head slightly higher, maintaining a clear line of sight as the distance reached its limit. Another man turned his head briefly toward the guards, holding his gaze for a moment before returning it to the boundary. A third prisoner stepped half a step forward again, then stopped in that position without continuing. The man at the edge lifted his foot once more, pausing for a brief moment before placing it down again, reducing the final distance to almost nothing. One prisoner near the front tightened his posture, standing rigid as he watched the movement. Another man adjusted his position slightly to the side, ensuring nothing blocked his view of what was about to happen. A third prisoner leaned forward again, then held that posture without moving further. The man at the edge extended his movement one final time, closing the last gap between himself and the boundary without turning or slowing further. One prisoner near the center stepped forward slightly, then stopped immediately after completing the motion. Another man near the back shifted his stance again, placing his feet firmly on the ground as he remained still. The man reached the boundary and did not stop at it, but continued forward, moving beyond the point where he was expected to remain. One prisoner near the front straightened suddenly, reacting to the crossing as it happened. Another man turned his head sharply toward the guards, waiting for a response that did not come. A third prisoner held his position completely still, no longer adjusting or shifting as he watched the outcome unfold. The guards remained exactly where they were, without movement, without command, and without any action that would interrupt what had just happened. The boundary that had defined the space for everyone else had now been crossed without consequence, and nothing changed in response to it. And as the man continued forward beyond that point and the absence of reaction remained unchanged, the fourth moment took place, because the limit that had existed for all of them no longer held its meaning. As the man continued walking beyond the boundary without turning back and without being stopped, the stillness across the yard began to change again, not through immediate movement, but through a shift in how the others held their positions and responded to what they had just seen. One prisoner near the front adjusted his stance, turning his body more fully toward the direction the man had taken, then holding that position without stepping forward. Another man beside him shifted his weight forward, placing one foot slightly ahead of the other as if preparing to move, then stopping before committing to the step. A third prisoner near the center took a small step forward, breaking his original position, then held that new position while watching the space ahead. One man closer to the edge moved half a step forward, increasing the distance between himself and the line, then remained still. Another prisoner turned his head toward the guards again, holding his gaze longer this time before returning it to the open space beyond the boundary. A third man leaned forward slightly, extending his posture as he watched, then held himself steady without moving further. The man who had crossed the boundary continued walking at a steady pace, increasing the distance behind him with each step without looking back. One prisoner near the back adjusted his footing again, placing his weight forward for a brief moment, then stopping as he maintained his position. Another man shifted his stance to the side, creating a small gap between himself and the others, then held that position. A third prisoner stepped forward again, completing a full step beyond where he had been standing, then stopped and remained there. One man near the center straightened his posture, fixing his attention forward without dividing it between the guards and the movement. Another prisoner moved his foot forward again, then stopped mid-motion before placing it down completely. A third man adjusted his position again, stepping a few inches forward before stopping and holding still. The space behind the boundary no longer held only one moving figure, but a growing sense of possibility that spread through the stillness. One prisoner near the front finally placed his foot forward beyond the line, completing the step and holding that position. Another man followed with a small movement, stepping forward slightly, without continuing further. A third prisoner shifted forward again, aligning himself closer to the direction that had been taken. The guards remained unchanged, offering no reaction, no command, and no indication that the movement would be stopped. The yard began to lose its original structure as more positions shifted forward, even if only slightly. And as the first signs of movement began to spread beyond a single person and into the group, the fifth moment took place, because what had been proven possible was no longer limited to one individual. As the small forward movements began to spread across the yard, and more prisoners shifted their positions beyond where they had originally stood, The pace of change slowed again, not because anything stopped it, but because each man had already crossed the point he once believed he could not. One prisoner near the front stepped forward fully beyond the line and held his position without continuing further, keeping his eyes fixed ahead. Another man beside him followed with a measured step, placing his foot forward and stopping immediately after completing the movement. A third prisoner near the center moved forward again, closing the distance toward the boundary, then stopped as he reached a new position. One man near the edge stepped beyond the original limit, then adjusted his stance slightly and remained still. Another prisoner turned his body fully toward the open space beyond the boundary, aligning himself with the new direction instead of the old formation. A third man stepped forward once more, then stopped without taking another step, holding his position firmly. One prisoner near the back advanced steadily, closing the gap between himself and those who had already moved, then stopped once he reached them. Another man shifted his footing and stepped slightly to the side, creating space as the formation dissolved further. A third prisoner adjusted his posture, straightening as he held his new position without moving again. One man who had remained still longer than the others finally stepped forward, placing his foot beyond the point where he had been standing and stopping there. Another prisoner looked briefly toward the guards, then returned his gaze forward and remained still. A third man shifted his weight forward again, then held himself steady without continuing. The scattered positions across the yard began to settle into a new arrangement, no longer defined by a line or a fixed boundary, but by individual positions held without instruction. One prisoner near the center moved slightly closer to another, reducing the distance between them, then stopped and held that position. Another man stepped forward once more, then stopped immediately after completing the movement, maintaining his place. A third prisoner adjusted his stance again, then remained still as the movement around him faded. The guards remained unchanged, continuing to observe without intervening, without restoring order, and without re-establishing any visible limit. The yard no longer held the structure it began with, but a new pattern where movement had stopped not because it was restricted, but because it was no longer being tested. And as the final adjustments came to an end and no further steps were taken, the last moment took place, because what had once been a boundary had lost its meaning and nothing had replaced it. They had expected the limits of the camp to be clear, to be enforced, and to define every step they were allowed to take. But as they watched one man cross that limit without being stopped and then began to follow in small, controlled movements, their understanding of that space changed in a way that did not require words, commands, or explanation, because what they saw unfold in front of them replaced what they had believed would happen. As hesitation turned into observation, and observation turned into movement, and movement finally settled into stillness again, the pattern that emerged was not created by control, but by the absence of it, allowing each prisoner to decide how far to move based on what did not happen rather than what did. And as the moment ended without any correction, interruption, or visible consequence, the realization remained clear through their actions alone, because the boundary they had once followed had been crossed, and nothing had been there to stop it. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.